Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Daled, and Mitzvah Hashem today. We will be learning Daf Reish Mem Gimel Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn the halachas of Eruvei Chatzeros. We pick up today on Reish Mem Gimel Amid Aleph. 3 lines off the bottom in the words of the Mechaber, a little bit into the line by the word Aval. Aval im hayuzu shaloi keneged zu. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Beis Yisrael Hanasun Batzara Bashivia Ha'im Debein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachim Aleihim V'Yitziyim Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu L'Oira B'Shibah L'Geula Hashtaba Gala V'Zman Kariv V'Nimar Mein. Our learning should be a schus for Refuah Shalema for Achi Agadol Moshe Ben Esther Fradel Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha Rivka Bashir Aleach Chava Hadassah Bas Rezel Serel Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malkachana and Yerucham ben Masha. They should all have a refuah shalema b'sayich shar chayil Yisrael, and our learning should be a schus. The Rebbe Shalom should watch over all of our brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. B'chol makom shehem. So we are here in Siman Shin Ayin Gimel and Sif Aleph, the only Sif in Shin Ayin Gimel. We have been discussing the case of shtei gzusterois haboltois mishtei aliyos zu keneged zu. So the case that we've been talking about, I'm not going to go into all the details of the case, but we've got two-story homes that are located across the Rishus Harabim from each other. They're opposite each other on the Rishus Harabim, across the Rishus Harabim, and they have 2 porches. These white cards are the 2 porches. And what you've done is you've taken a neser, you've taken a plank of wood, and you went ahead and you laid it from one porch to the other porch. And what we've learned is that if that plank of wood is dalit tfachim wide, then that plank of wood can form a pesach between these 2 gzusterois. Now, once we have a pesach between the 2 gzusterois, that means we have a pesach between the 2 balconies, we have a pesach between the 2 houses, and we have a pesach between the 2 chatzeros that these 2 houses open onto. The house on one side of the street opens to one chutzner. The house on the other side of the street opens to a different chutzner. They have these 2 gzusterois, the plank of wood, the gesher, the bridge that's dalet tfachim wide, is now a pesach effectively between the 2 chatzeros. Of course, we learned a whole slew of details regarding this halacha in the previous year. Now, the only time you need such a gesher, the only time you need a bridge to form a Pesach is when the 2 gzusterois are at least dalit tfachim apart from each other. If, however, the 2 gzusterois would be within dalit tfachim of each other, then it's very easy to step from one balcony to the other balcony. You wouldn't even need a gesher. Now we're continuing to talk about the same case. We're going to tweak the case a little bit. In the case that we've been talking about until now, we're assuming that the 2 gzusterois, the 2 balconies, are directly opposite and level with each other. Now, the way the terminology that the Mishnah Berurah used was one house is on the north side of the Rishus Harabim, the other house is on the south side of Rishus Harabim. So they're separated north and south. Now, what if they're not directly opposite each other? What if one porch is more easterly than the other porch, or more westerly than the other porch? So they're like this across the Rishus Harabim, right? They're not directly opposite each other. In that case, we're going to see that a gesher, a plank of wood, a neser, going from one to the other, cannot effectively make a Pesach. So too, even if they're directly opposite each other, if one is higher than the other one, then also a plank of wood going on an incline also cannot effectively create a Pesach. It can't be used as a gesher, as a bridge, to make a Pesach between the chatzeros. Let's see it inside, says the Mechaber. Avol. Im hayu zu shaloi keneged zu. If the 2 gzusterois are not directly opposite each other. Sha'achas meshucha lemizrach. One is moved away laterally to the east, va'achas l'mayriv, and the other one is separated from it laterally to the west. So they're not like this, directly opposite each other across the Rishus Harabim. They're like this. Now, if you want to make a bridge, what do you have to do? You have to take the bridge, you have to take your plank, you're going to put your plank from the corner of one gzustera, of one balcony, and you're going to bring it to the corner of the opposing balcony. And the plank itself is going to be going at an angle between the two balconies. In that case, the Mechaber says that cannot be a bridge, and therefore, Einam Yechaylim La'arid Yachad, such a bridge would not allow them to join in a joint Eruv Chatzeros. V'chein, and similarly says the Mechaber, if one porch is elevated above the other porch, they are directly opposite them, each other, across the Rosh Hashanah, but one is higher than the other. Also, lo chashiv Pesach, you cannot use a plank on an incline to make a Pesach. Says the Mechaber weiter, V'hani mili kishemeruchakos zu mizu shloisha tvachim. Says the Mechaber, the only time that we have this concern is if they're separated from each other by more than 3 tvachim. Now, what does that mean? Mishnah Berurah is going to be very careful to make sure we understand that what this means. When we speak about the porches being separated from each other, in this case of the Mechaber, we're talking about 2 different distances of separation. Let's remember. Let's start with the simple case. The 2 porches directly opposite each other. When do you need a gesher? When do you need a bridge to form a Pesach between the 2 gzusteros? Only if they're separated by more than 4 tvachim. If they're within 4 tvachim of each other, it's easy to step from one to the other. You don't need a gesher. You don't need a bridge. You don't need a Pesach. They're considered one. They're considered as if they're attached to each other because it's easy to step from one to the other. So the only time these halachas are germane is when the porches are separated by more than 4 tvachim. When the Mechaber says over here, V'hani mili kishemeruchakos zu mizu shloisha tvachim, what he means is, in the context of the halacha that the Mechaber just told us, the Mechaber said, when could you use the gesher? When they're directly opposite each other. But if they're apart laterally, east and west, right, they're not directly opposite, they're like this, then you cannot use the gesher to connect them. When is that true, says the Mechaber? When the separation from east to west is at least by 3 tvachim. Now, obviously they have to be apart from each other more than 4 tvachim for this whole halacha to start, right? Because if they're within, in other words, if they're like this, if they're within, why are they not? Oh, there we go. If they're within 4 tvachim of each other, then we don't need a plank at all. What the Mechaber is saying is, when we're concerned about the separation side to side, it only becomes a problem if the lateral distance between them, if the separation is more than 3 tvachim. But if they're within 3 tvachim, it would be okay. So v'hani mili kishemeruchakos zu mizu shloisha tvachim, avalim heim toich shloisha zu lezu, bein berichuk, bein begoiva, right? So let's say, here's a simple case, right? Let's say the 2 gzusteros are 4 tvachim apart from each other. So you need a plank, right? One is above the other. Well, how much above the other is it? If it's only 1 tefach higher than the other, you're still okay. If it's 2 tvachim, you're still okay. Now, still, in this direction, they're only 4 tvachim apart. They're 4 tvachim apart, right? But in the up and down direction, in the vertical direction, right? It's only a problem when they're separated in the height by more than 3 tvachim. If they're within 3 tvachim, we're going to say lavud, and so too when we're talking side by side. So v'hani mili kishemeruchakos zu mizu shloisha tvachim. Avalim heim toich shloisha zu lezu bein berichuk bein begoiva chashiv shaper kepesach. Says the Mishnah Berurah ois cotton ches. Mishucha lemizrach b'tzad eloymar. What the Mechaber means to say is mishucha mimakim chaverta litzad mizrach. If they're not opposite each other, if they're drawn apart laterally, so one is more to the east, ois cotton tes, einim yichaylim la'ariv yachad. They cannot join in a joint Eruv Chatzeros based on a bridge of dalet tvachim between them. Why? Because it's such a case where they're separated this way from each other. How are you going to make this gesher? You're going to do it. You're going to take the neser and you're going to put it yavai mikeren zavis shelzu lezu. You're going to take it from the corner. In the regular case where they're directly opposite each other, you're going to put the plank in middle of the gzustera. But when they're drawn apart from each other, east and west, you're going to go from the corner of one porch to the corner of the other porch. Why is that a problem, says the Mishnah Berurah? This is a rule that we've seen before and we're going to see again in Hilchas Eruvin. Upischa bekeren zavis loy avdi inchi. We've had this before. We don't make a Pesach on the corner of a house. That was not traditionally done. One of the reasons it's not traditionally done is because structurally, a Pesach in the corner of a house compromises the structural integrity of two walls of the house. Usually you put a door on one wall and you have to deal with the structural integrity of that wall. When you put it in the corner of a home, you're compromising the structural integrity of two walls. You don't want to do that. So you don't usually have a Pesach in the corner of a structure. And what is this gesher? What is this bridge? We're trying to use it as a Pesach, right? And we don't make a Pesach on a corner. That's one problem. The Gam. Furthermore, it says the Mishnah Berurah, Levisha eina gesher yashar ela ba'alach sein oimed. In such a case, your gesher is not going straight across. Your gesher is going at an angle. Misyari adam lavar boy, and therefore a person is afraid to walk on it. Now you'll ask me, what's the difference? If I'm walking across the plank in a straight line from one gzustera to another gzustera that's directly opposite me, I'm walking in a straight line across the gesher. If I have a gesher that goes at an angle to a porch that's diagonally across from me, I'm also walking in a straight line on the gesher. What does it mean that I'm walking at an angle? There's a big difference. Because the brain works visually. When you're standing on a balcony and there's another balcony directly opposite you, and you see clearly that you're walking to a nice open area opposite you, that's easier to handle than when you're walking off a corner, right? And you're only walking onto another corner of another gzustera. Visually, that's much more difficult. The brain takes a lot of visual cues, especially when it comes to issues of balance, etc. And therefore, this would be hard for a person to do. If the porches are not separated vertically or laterally by more than 3 tvachim, then it's okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Chashuv Shaper Kepesach, Pirush Devikilu Aneser Munach Bishave. If the vertical distance or the lateral distance is less than 3 tvachim, we consider it to be straight. You should know. In the Mishnah Berurah spells out what we're talking about. In all of these cases, we have to be talking about that the separation this way between the two gzusteros is at least 4 tfachim or more. Otherwise, we don't need a bridge at all. Right? So again, the gzusteros are separated this way by more than 4 tfachim. Otherwise, this whole conversation doesn't start. Because you don't need a bridge if it's less than 4 tfachim. You just step from one to the other. So what we're talking about is that it's separated by more than 4 tfachim. But in the vertical height, what's the height differential? If the height differential is less than 3, you're okay. If the height differential is more than 3, you have a problem. We're saying if the height difference is less than 3, you could use an eser, you could make a gesher out of a plank, which you need because they're separated from each other by more than 4 tvachim. Again, in this case, in the lateral, in the east-west case, again, we're talking about where the separation across is at least 4 tvachim, and what we're concerned with is the lateral, the east-west separation. Is the east-west separation 3 tvachim or more? If that gap is less than 3 tvachim, Arminan Lavud, Vevikilu Heimzu Kenegedzu. Va'az, and then, Avshadain Yesh Avarachik Bezuluzu Yoisemer about tvachim, right? If the east-west differential is less than 3 tvachim, even though this differential is more than 4 tvachim, you could use a bridge. Mutter al yidei neser shenoisin bein zulazu. That concludes Siman Shin Ayin Gimel. Let's turn to Siman Shin Ayin Daled. Nistam b'Shabbos Pesach Chaloin b'makom she'erev bay u'bay dalet seifim. So we've learned already quite thoroughly that in order for two chatzeros to be able to join in a joint Eruv chatzeros, if the two chatzeros are separated by a kaisel, by a wall, there has to be some form of access through, across that wall. There has to be a pesach, a doorway, or a chaloin, or a window, or ladders, or some of the other things we learned in Siman Shinayin Beis, but there has to be an access point between the two chatzeros in order to allow for them to join in a joint Eruv chatzeros. What if that access point got closed up? That's the topic of Shinayin Daled. So, Nistam b'Shabbos, what happens if on Shabbos, Pesach Chaloin b'makom she'erev bay, the doorway between the two chatzeros, or the window between the two chatzeros that allowed the two chatzeros to join in a joint Eruv chatzeros, what if it got closed up on Shabbos? Ubay dalet seifim, and here we have 4 seifim. Let's see the Mechaber Sif Aleph. Ervu derech chaloin oy pesach shebeneim. If two chatzeros made a joint Eruv chatzeros based on a window or a doorway that existed between their two chatzeros, then nistam b'Shabbos, and now it got closed up on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut an aleph in nistam b'Shabbos kigoyin shenafla ma'polis kenegdoi. Let's say you had a wall that was not 10 tefachim tall. You had a wall that was 20 tefachim tall, right? And it had a doorway. The doorway was 10 tefachim tall and 4 tefachim wide. So it's a perfectly good doorway. But now the top 5 tefachim of the wall collapsed, and the rubble is blocking the doorway. So now the doorway got closed up. So you made an Eruv chatzeros before Shabbos, a joint Eruv chatzeros between chatzer A, chatzer B, based on the fact that you have a doorway between the two chatzeros. But now on Shabbos there was a collapse. Rubble is blocking the doorway. Now you no longer have a doorway. What happens to your Erev? Says the Mechaber. Ervu derech aloyna pesach shebeneim v'nistam b'Shabbos. You joined in a joint Eruv chatzeros based on the existence of a chaloin, a window, or a pesach, or a doorway that existed between the two chatzeros. V'nistam b'Shabbos, and it became blocked up on Shabbos. Mutarim lehishtamesh derech goyva ha'koisel v'choirav. You're still allowed to transfer from the house in one chotzer to the chotzer of the other chotzer, or to the houses in the other chotzer. How? Either derech goyva ha'koisel, you could go over the wall, even though the wall is 10 tefachim or more tall. Yeah, not hard to climb over a 10 tefach tall wall. You could go over the wall and you could transfer. Or if there's a little hole in the wall, choirav, if there's a 2 tefach by 2 tefach hole in the wall, you could pass the herring and the kichel that came from the bias in one chotzer through the hole in the wall to the chotzer of the other chotzer. Even though a 2 by 2 hole in the wall is not big enough to allow you to join in a joint Eruv chatzeros, and if there's a 10 tefach tall kaisel between the chatzeros, the ability to climb over the wall doesn't allow you to join in a joint Eruv chatzeros. But since you joined in a joint Eruv chatzeros before Shabbos, based on the existence of a doorway or a window that was there at the outside of Shabbos, it remains mutter for the entirety of Shabbos. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Eis Cotton Beis, mutarim lehishtamesh mizu lezu. You're allowed to transfer, let's say, kelim shashafsu babayis, from one chotzer to the other chotzer, b'Shabbos zu, on this Shabbos. Says the Shar Tzion in Ois Cotton Aleph, the L'Shabbos Acheres b'vadei oser. By next Shabbos, you got to fix this, right? But for this Shabbos, you're allowed to transfer. Says the Mishnah Berurah weiter, v'cholshkein kol achas la'atzma dubuteres af oisa sheina erev munachas besoicha. Certainly, a kolshkein, a kalvachomer, says the Chavetz Chaim. The halacha, the first halacha that we said that the Mishnah Berurah told us over here is mutarim lehishtamesh. The Mechaber said derech goyva ha'koisel v'choirav. You're allowed to transfer, let's say, from a house in Chotzer A to the Chotzer of Chotzer B, or to a house in Chotzer B. You're allowed to do that. Now says the Mishnah Berurah, kolshkein, in Chotzer A itself or in Chotzer B itself, you're allowed to transfer Kelim Sheshavsu Babayis into the Chotzer, or Kelim Sheshavsu Bachotzer into the houses. And you're allowed to do this even in the Chotzer that does not have the Erev. So let's just unpack this. There are like 3 different levels of Heterim that we have over here. Again, what's the case? The case is you made a perfectly good and a perfectly allowable Eruv Chatzeres. Chotzer A, Chotzer B, separated by a wall, but there's a doorway or a chaloin. The chaloin is daled al daled. The doorway is at least 10 high and 4 wide. It allows you to join in a joint Eruv Chatzeres. They did so. So they made a perfectly good, a perfectly kosher, allowable Eruv Chatzeres before Shabbos. Now on Shabbos, this opening, whether it's a door or a window, got closed up. So you no longer have the opening that allowed you to join in the joint Eruv Chatzeros. Says the Mechaber, the Erev is bimkaimai omedes. You're still allowed to be mishtamish in these Chatzeros. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what does that mean? Well, let's go from one step to the next. Says the Mishnah Berurah first, the biggest chiddush, which is, even though now there's a kaisel separating Chotzer A and Chotzer B with no opening, you still could take a Keli Sheshavas Babayis in Chotzer A and bring it to the Chotzer of Chotzer B, or to a house in Chotzer B. That's one. Number 2, Kolshke. How about in each Chotzer itself? Could you go from the bias of Chotzer A to the Chotzer of Chotzer A? Could you go from the bias of Chotzer B to the Chotzer of Chotzer B? Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's a Kal V'chomer. If you could go from one Chotzer to the other Chotzer, you certainly could still transfer within one Chotzer. Why is that a Kolshkein? Why is that a Kal V'chomer? I mean, it seems to be part of the same Chiddush. The Chiddush is that the Erev remains in effect, even though you don't have an opening. But it seems that the Chavetz Chaim considers this to be a Kal V'chomer because the fact that you could transfer from one Chotzer to the other, even though there's no opening in the kaisel between it, that seems to be a bigger chiddush than allowing transfer within one Chotzer. Within one Chotzer, nothing changed. What changed was between the 2 Chatzeres. So, okay, so the Mishnah Berurah sees this as a Kal V'chomer. But now another layer of chiddush over here is, in that halacha, well, let's think for a minute. Where is the Erev? If Chotzer A and Chotzer B joined in a joint Eruv Chatzeros, where is the box of matzah? The box of matzah is in one house, either in Chotzer A or Chotzer B. Everybody from Chotzer A and Chotzer B got together, they joined in a box of matzahs, and it went to one of the houses in one of the Chatzeros. So let's say the Erev is in Chotzer A. If the Erev is in Chotzer A, it's very easy to understand that even though the opening in the wall between Chotzer A and Chotzer B got closed up on Shabbos, in Chotzer A, the people of Chotzer A could still transfer from their houses to the Chotzer, and vice versa. Why not? They joined in a Eruv Chatzeres, and their Erev is in their Chotzer. So why not? You want the other Chotzer to aser on them? The other Chotzer is not going to aser on them. The wall is closed. So that's very easy to understand. But what about the people of Chotzer B? The people in Chotzer B are now closed off from Chotzer A because their kaisel no longer has a mechitza and an opening. And where's their Erev? Their Erev is in Chotzer A. But even the people in Chotzer B are still allowed to transfer from their houses to the Chotzer, etc., etc. So, in other words, at the end of the day, the chiddush over here is, even though this joint Eruv Chatzeros was made based on an opening that existed in the wall between the 2 Chatzeros, and now that opening no longer exists, it got closed up on Shabbos, the Erev is completely bimkaimai omedes. It remains completely in effect in the context of all the halachas of Eruv Chatzeros. We have yet to see why. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Gimel. You're allowed to transfer from one chotzer to the other. Derek Goiva Kaisel the Chayrav. You could go over the wall, or you could pass through the little openings. The Chayrav Ritzayin Eloymar. What the Mechaber means to say is, Avagav the Akshav Shenistam. Even though now that the opening got closed up, Ein Ru'uyin Lehis Arev Yachad. Right now, you have no heter to join in the Jut Eruv Chatzeros. The Haloy Ein Bachayrin Shir Chaloin. because these little holes that exist in the wall are not big enough to allow for the Eruv Chatzeros. You're going to pass the herring and the kichel through a 2 tefach by 2 tefach opening. That 2 tefach by 2 tefach opening is not dalet al dalet. It doesn't allow you to join in a joint Eruv Chatzeros. Afilu hachi lo nisbata lo erev al shabazu. The erev is not bottle because the opening got closed up for the duration of this Shabbos. Why? And finally, we come to the heter, the basis of the heter, something that we've learned already many times before. The keven shehuter betchilas haShabbos, huter l'chal haShabbos. Since the erev was okay ben hashmoshes when Shabbos came in, and when the erev became activated, when the erev was chal, you had an opening. Keven shehutra, hutra, it remains in effect for the entirety of Shabbos. Now, let's go to the next case. Says the Mechaber, second line in, Va'afilu im erev l'shana, even in another case. So now, we have to understand this va'afilu, even, right? Means a bigger chiddush. In the first case of the Mechaber, it's very easy to apply the rule of Shabbos kevet shehutra hutra. At Bein Hashmoshes, when the erev kicked in, everything was kosher v'yosher. We had an opening that allowed us to join in and join the Eruv Chatzeros. Okay, that's it. Once the erev was activated b'kashrus, Shabbos kevet shehutra hutra. But now we have a bigger chiddush. Let's say va'afilu im erev l'shana. Let's say the Gabbai and the Rav made an Eruv Chatzeros on erev Pesach, and they made the Eruv Chatzeros with the intention that the Eruv Chatzeros should be active for all of the Shabbosos of the year. So it was very clear when they made the Erev, we're not making this Erev for one Shabbos, we're not making this Erev for a month, we're making this Erev for a year. Va'afilu im erev l'shana. And now what happened? V'nistam ha-Pesach b'choil. On Yom Shlishi, Tuesday, of Parshas Tazria u'Metzora, the opening in the wall became closed up. So it got closed up during the week. Okay. V'niftach b'Shabbos. And then it was reopened Shabbos afternoon. Ooh, very interesting. Very interesting. What happened by Bein Hashmoshes of Parshas Tazria u'Metzora? Bein Hashmoshes going into Shabbos of Parshas Tazria u'Metzora, there was no opening. The opening got closed up on Tuesday. It got closed up on Yom Shlishi. When did it get reopened? Shabbos afternoon. So when Shabbos came in, Erev Shabbos, Parshas Tazria u'Metzora, there was no opening that allowed for a joint Eruv Chatzeros. That's why this second case of the Mechaber is a bigger chiddush. It's va'afilu. So again, va'afilu im erev l'shana. Even in a case where the Rav and the Gabbai made an Eruv Chatzeros for the entire year. V'nistam ha-Pesach b'choil, and the opening got closed up during the week. V'niftach b'Shabbos, and it didn't get reopened until on Shabbos, so it was not opened when Shabbos came in, Ben Hashmoshes. And, says the Ramah, another level of chiddush, va'afilu stama b'mezid, even if the opening did not get closed up because of a collapse. No, somebody went with a sheet of plywood and with screws and an impact driver and closed it up. Bedafka it was closed up, right? And it stayed closed up until Shabbos afternoon. It's still okay. Chazar ha'erev leheteroi. Now, it's not okay until it gets reopened. But once it gets reopened, it's okay. Chazar ha'erev leheteroi. It's chazar and eir. The erev wakes up again on Shabbos when it gets reopened. Okay, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois katan dalid. So again, the doorway or the window got closed up on Tuesday, and then v'niftach b'Shabbos, and then it got opened on Shabbos afternoon. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Tzadar Loimar, what the Mechaber wants to say with this afilu case is, Loi mi bayim niftach kaidam haShabbos. Forget about the case, the first case, where the opening was reopened, where the opening was opened on Shabbos, right? In the first case of the Mechaber, when Bein Hashmoshes, when Shabbos came in, the opening was opened. The collapse happened on Shabbos. So over there, it's it was very easy to understand. If the opening was opened when Shabbos came in at Ben Hashmashas, yeah, we understand that we have an Erev for the duration of Shabbos. Because when Shabbos started, everything was open. So if there was a collapse, let's say on Tuesday, or they closed up the opening on Tuesday, but it was opened Friday morning, so fine. So in that case, it's very easy to understand that we have a good Erev. Because when Ben Hashmashas rolled around and Shabbos came in, we had an opening. So okay, that's very easy to understand. Ela afilu im niftach b'Shabbos gufa. The chiddush over here is that by Ben Hashmashas on Erev Shabbos, you didn't have an opening to allow for a joint Eruv Chatzeros. It only became good on Shabbos. Shabbos afternoon, it got reopened. Ela afilu im niftach b'Shabbos gufa. Mikam makayim. Nevertheless, Kevin shebe'es hanachas ha'erev. Here's what a lumdus is. Kevin shebe'es hanachas ha'erev. Since at the time that the Erev was created, on Erev Pesach, shehiniach lekama Shabbosos, they made the Erev at that point for many Shabbosos, oy l'shana, or maybe for the entire year. And at that point, oy Pesach mizul uzu v'chalo Erev. So you hear, the Rav and the Gabbai made the Erev on Erev Pesach. And on Erev Pesach, when they made that Erev, they did it for the intent for it to be good for the entire year. And when the first Shabbos rolled around at Ben Hashmashas, there was an opening between the two Chatzeros. So the Erev was good. Lachein, therefore, Av Shebeshabbos Acheres, Hayasasam Etchilas HaShabbos, even though Shabbos Parshas Bamidbar, on Erev Shabbos there was no opening, it was closed up. And therefore at that point there was no heter to make a joint Eruv Chatzeros. Mikamokim loy nisbatel. The Erev is not bottle. Umiyad sheniftach, and therefore on Shabbos afternoon, when the opening gets opened, chazara Erev le'tera rishain. The Erev comes back into power. So again, what are we saying over here? Case number one of the Mechaber was a very, very basic case. When Shabbos came in, you had a perfect Erev. You had an opening, everything was good. Shabbos afternoon, there was a collapse. The opening got closed up. You're okay. Why? Shabbos came to Hutra. There was a good Erev, Ben Hashmashas, it remains in place for the entirety of Shabbos. Second case, when the doorway got closed on Tuesday, Erev Shabbos, it was still closed. But when was this Erev made? This Erev was made back on Erev Pesach, and it was intended to be in place for the whole year. Okay, so when the Erev was originally made, you had an opening between the Chatzeros that allows for a joint Eruv Chatzeros. Since it was good then, when the Erev was originally made, it remains in place, at least to the extent that now when Shabbos Parshas Bamidbar rolls around, and at Ben Hashmashas there was no opening, so, okay, Friday night, the Erev is no good. Shabbos morning, the Erev is no good. But if Shabbos afternoon, the opening gets reopened, the Erev reactivates. Even though at Ben Hashmashas of this Shabbos, there was no opening to allow for such an Erev, yeah, but on Erev Pesach there was. And on Erev Pesach was done with the intent of lasting for the whole year. So that's good enough to allow the Erev to reactivate when the opening becomes reopened. Eis Katan Hey, the Ramah stuck in another chiddush. Va'afilu saspan b'mezid. This is true even if this wasn't an inadvertent closure of the opening. It wasn't a collapse. It was a contractor coming with a sheet of plywood and a box of screws and an impact driver. It was closed up b'mezid. Hainu b'kavana, with intent. The Dan, you should know, says the Mishnah Berurah, the Magen Avram v'kama achroinim tziddu less of a zekah shechazer v'niftach b'Shabbos. The Magen Avram and many other achroinim are not happy with this halacha. They say that if somebody went and closed up the opening between the two chatzeres b'mezid, have a kebitala erev b'yadayim. Now you are mevatel the erev. By doing that, you made a clear statement. We don't want an erev. We want to break apart the shutfis that was created by the erev. So now it's bittul erev biyadayim. V'im kein kevin sheben hashmasha shuz man chaloisa erev hayadayim sasum. If somebody closed up the erev b'dafka on Yom Shlishi of Parshas Bamidbar, so they were mevatel the Erev. Now, when Erev Shabbos Parshas Bamidbar rolled around, it was still closed. So when Ben Hashmashas came and the Erev was supposed to kick in, it was the two Chatzeres were still separated because the opening was closed. Loi mahani kisheniftach achakach b'Shabbos kufa. Now, when it gets reopened on Shabbos afternoon, the Erev cannot reactivate. So in other words, the basis of the heter to allow for the reactivation of the Erev is that the Erev was not bottle. It's true that the Erev was, so to speak, damaged when the doorway was closed up from a collapse on Yom Shlishi Parshas Bamidbar. The Erev was damaged, and by Ben Hashmashas of Erev Shabbos going into Shabbos Parshas Bamidbar, there was no opening, so there is no kosher Erev because the Erev is damaged, but the Erev is not bottle. And since it's not bottle, when it gets reopened on Shabbos afternoon, it's chaz of a neir, it could go kick in again. It could reactivate. But if it wasn't closed up on Yom Shlishi Parshas Bamidbar because of a collapse, it was closed up on Yom Shlishi Parshas Bamidbar by a contractor who went pedafka to close it, they were mevatel the Erev. Since they were mevatel the Erev, it cannot reactivate Shabbos afternoon when the opening is reopened. That's according to the Magen Avram and other Achrayim. The Mechaber holds not that way. Ve'en lahakil kishasas by b'mezid, says the Mishnah Berurah halacha l'maisa, we shouldn't be makel when it was closed up at Mezid, el kisheniftach kaidam haShabbos. We could only be makel that if it was closed up b'mezid on Tuesday afternoon, if it was reopened before Shabbos started, then we could be makel. Now that's still a chiddush, because if the Erev is bottle, then there would be a good argument to make that you have to make a new Erev. You need a new box of matzah, you need a new zechia, you need a new everything, because they were mevatel the Erev, they were mevatel the shutvis. So there's still a level of chiddush here to say that if it was closed b'mezid, but it was reopened before Shabbos, before Ben Hashmashas going into Shabbos, it could still reactivate. So that much of a chiddush, the Mishnah Berurah says we could do. Does Amrinan, Avshin is Patel Mei Kara, Kevich Chazav and Iftach, Harel Kopanim Shutfin Bapashal Erev. What still allows us to reactivate the Erev? Because Lamaisid is still the box of matzah. Everybody contributed to the box of matzah, or the Rav and the Gabai, they made a zechia on behalf of everybody. So an element of the shutvis still exists in that box of matzah. So we still have an element of shutvis that will allow the Erev to reactivate if the opening was reopened before Ben Hashmashas. Well, Ben Hashmashas, she was my Kniyas Erev, Hari Yesh Pesach B'Neim Sharoy La'arev. And Lamaisa, you have the shutvis of the box of matzah, and you have that at the Shas Kniyas Erev, there was an opening by Ben Hashmashas coming into Shabbos. So okay, then we can be Mekel. V'ayin b'bir halacha, Shabiyarnu Shekin Roy Linig Lamaisa. Achein, in be'esha sasmai hoya b'daita rak l'fisha v'akach lachsa l'paschai mistaber the mutar af kishachazav v'niftach b'Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, look, if a contractor closed up the opening that allows for the joint to Rivach Hatzeros because he has to make a repair to the wall, not because he wants to be mevatel the shutvis, he's doing it to make a repair to the wall, and the clear intent was he's starting a job Tuesday afternoon, he's finishing it Friday morning, and the intent was to close it temporarily and reopening it. Then, if something went wrong and he didn't get to reopen it before Shabbos, and it got reopened on Shabbos, we could still be mekel. Okay, could we go a little bit weiter? Yes, we can. Let's try to finish the sif. Says the Mechaber bottom line. Ula Rambam, the Rambam is a little bit more machmir over here. This is going back on the first case of Sif Aleph, the simple case, the basic case. They made an Erev based on an opening that existed in the wall. The wall got closed up on Shabbos. The opening was opened by Ben Hashmashas when the Erev kicked in. It got closed on Shabbos. All right, Shabbos came to Hutra. The Mechaber said the Erev remains fully in place in all of its details. You could transfer from a bias in one chutzner to the chutzner of the other chutzner. You could certainly transfer within each chutzner itself, chutzner A, chutzner B, from the houses to the chatzeros. That was the sheet of the Mechaber. The Rambam is more machmer. The Rambam ein mutal taltal el kolachas la'atzma avol mizula zuloi. The Rambam says that in that first case of this Siman, When you made an Erev based on an opening, and the opening was there when Shabbos kicked in, but it got closed on Shabbos, yes, we say Shabbos Shehutra, Kevet Shehutra Hutra, but only to a certain extent. Only to allow tiltal in the individual Chatzeros. Chatzer A, they could transfer Keli Shashanos Babayis to the Chatzer, so could Chatzer B, each in their own Chatzeros, even in the Chatzer that doesn't have the Erev. They could still do that. But to go from one Chatzer to the other, the Rambam says that that's also. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Rambam Kaya Reish Asif. This is going back to the first case in the beginning of Sif Aleph, where the opening got closed up on Shabbos. According to the first opinion of the Mechaber, you're allowed to transfer even from Chatzer A to Chatzer B and vice versa. But according to the Rambam, the only heter is for internal transfers in each Chatzer. There's still a Chiddush. Like I said earlier, to allow internal transfers in the Chatzer that has the Erev, that's no stretch. Why not? The Erev is in their Chatzer. They're all shutfin in that Erev. They all live in one house in their Chatzer. The other Chatzer is closed off from them now. Can't aser on them. That's not a stretch. The Chiddush is that even the other Chatzer could do internal transfers. Even though they don't have the Erev, they could still do it. Why? I think because there's still an element of shutfis in the box of matzah. Even the Rambam is not machmer when the opening gets reopened on Shabbos. So the opening was opened by Ben Hashmashas. It got closed up Shabbos morning. So now, according to the Rambam, internal transfers in each chutzner okay. Transfers from one chutzner to the other, not okay. If the opening gets reopened on Shabbos, even according to the Rambam, everything becomes mutter again. Linyan halacha ha'ikar kisvara rishayna ken kasvara achrayim. The Mishnah Berurah says halacha lemaisa. We would follow the mokuladika dei rishayna. We would not follow the shita of the Rambam. So says the achrayim. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman Torah. Discussing Liman Torah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rabbeinu Shalom. The Rabbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua's refuahs panal shetuchim to those in need. We should be zeicher to see the B'yis Gal Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu amen. Be well.